Okay, welcome back, everyone, to the exercise today. We were going to break into two groups, but we've got pretty small number of people, so we'll probably do this together. We're going to focus on, just as a hypothetical project, which is actually a potential real project, the Capital City Light Rail, Line 1, which is slated to be a public-private partnership. So we thought we'd just go through some of the questions that you should be asking if you are looking at this as a potential project, and maybe we can write up what we find out, what we conclude, and we'd like to do that in the manner of what we've been talking about the last couple days, the last day and today, just to go through the process of, what we have the issues up here, the categories that we'd like to examine. Who are the stakeholders? What are some of the objectives for a project like this? We know generally the size based on the preliminary investigation, and we've got a map of that project. Maybe some of you know the Capital City better than we do, but I'll hand these out, one or two to each side, so you can see it, so you know where the project runs, and then address the scope of the project and start talking about what some of the options might be, what some of the selection criteria might be for those options, and what some of the hurdles are. So we'll just probably go through, and before we do that, I'll just run through a few slides that kind of describe some of the considerations. I've been involved in a number of transit projects, and so have Samuel. So we know some of the issues, and it might be useful just to take a look at that before we start asking you questions. You can use some of this material for your answers, but first of all, why would you do a project like this? Anybody know what the objective would be to put transit in this part of the city?
Traffic jams?
Traffic jams.
Yeah.
Traffic congestion, absolutely.
Yep.
I've driven here now 2 or 3 days for different reasons, and there is a congestion problem. Any other considerations that might, fall into your objective?
So why else would we want to build a light rail system from point A to point B? Relieving traffic is certainly one of them. But people, thinking through why people move anywhere, right? Why do people move anywhere? So I guess, what does a transit system do? What's the main point of a transit system?
Yeah, what another way to look at it, what would the objective of the city be?
Yeah.
To put a transit system like this in? They're very expensive, but why would they go to that trouble? I mean, congestion is one item. It may not be the only reason you do it, and it may end up, when you analyze it, it may not be the enough of a justification for a project like this. So what are some of the other reasons? Do we have a translator working? Maybe? I can't hear. Yes?
Pretty sure.
Oh, yeah, I'm off. That's my problem.
So not just moving people from point A to point B. So connectivity of your citizens, giving them an option, more options for mobility, as we say, being able to move without the use of a car, that could be another or that could be another reason for implementing something like this. And with that reason, you probably want to think about what would be some of the goals of, I guess let's use those two. Those two could be good reasons to implement any light rail system, right? So far we have relieving traffic, because we know there's a lot of traffic in the city center, and we have giving people more options for how they move around in the city. So if you don't have a car, what does that look like? So what could be some of the goals around those two? Maybe they're environmental goals, maybe they're social goals as far as low cost transportation. I'd like to hear from you, what if you were building this transit system, which maybe one day you will, what would you want to see as far as goals and benefits to the community, the objectives of the project? I want to start asking questions specifically. You, sir, what do you think would be a goal or objective you would like to see with this?
Decentralization, reducing the population density.
Increasing the population density, is that what I heard?
Yeah. Well, that matters to populate.
Oh, okay. So giving people options for where they can live, it sounds like.
Yeah, developing sub-cities.
Oh, okay, yeah. So we'll call that real estate development slash, what am I thinking as far as?
Higher density, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Allowing higher density?
Transit-oriented development.
Yeah.
Transit, in the US, we call that transit-oriented development. Yeah,
And
that's a good one.
I think there's the airport.
The
What
airport?
was that?
Oh, yeah, the airport. So giving people more options to get to the airport as well.
Yeah, government of Mongolia is concentrated on and developing economic free zone right there.
So a job center, maybe?
Yeah,
A job center, getting
Yeah.
people to and from where jobs are at. That's always a very good reason.
How about from an environmental point of view?
Are there any economic or any environmental reasons that a system like this would benefit the larger, the city itself and also Mongolia in general? Okay, we're going to move to this table over here. This gentleman right here. What do you think would be some economic, or rather some environmental implications of this system? Air pollution. Okay, so reducing air pollution.
Better land use, he said.
What was that last one? What did you say? Land use. Gotcha. Okay, so we have the environmental benefits, we have the socio-economic benefits, I guess we could call them.
Mhm.
Is there anything else we'd like to include as maybe some of the goals and the objectives of the system?
Well, yeah, you may have mentioned, does everybody have a car in Capital City, pretty much? Yes, oh, they do, okay. So it might allow people not to have the expense of a car and a parking space.
Yeah, so reducing cost of living to people in the city center or wherever this new system will go to. If you don't have to pay for a car or auto insurance or gas, that could potentially reduce your cost of living by 20% a year. So I don't know what a car is worth, but in the US is generally about 25% of your total cost of living. So a reduction in cost of living.
Can anyone just help some of us not familiar with the city? If you can tell from this line, where does it go? Does it actually go to the airport? Or Can you tell from this map?
To the airport.
Yes?
Yeah.
To the airport?
Uh-huh.
And then what's the other end of the line?
Part of the city. So from the south, it cuts through the city to the northern part of the city where there are summer touches. So it's point A is the airport in the south of the city, and then it cuts through the city in the north. Samadacha.
And then to the other side, there's a small place where people are usually going for picnics, this kind of place. Very famous here.
And Summer Tacha area
Exactly.
is a very important part of the city, I would imagine.
Yeah, because of the air pollution, many Mongolians are willing to breathe the fresh air. So, and then the nearest place to go there is Sanjai.
Ah, okay, so it goes all the way to the outside portion of the city.
Exactly.
Okay. So,
Hmm.
so connecting where people either live currently or want to live in the future without having to have a car.
Yeah.
All right, so land
That's a
use
good
again.
one.
Cool, awesome.
And access to the airport, I think you mentioned, but this would allow people not to have to drive or take a taxi to the airport, I guess, at least along this corridor. So that's a great objective. Most transit lines now in major cities definitely want to get to the airport. Washington, D.C. just completed an extension of its system to its airport after 40 years of planning. They finally got that built. And I might talk about that as an example at some point during the exercise.
Gotcha.
Okay,
And maybe you want to go a little bit, just take a few of these objectives and think about maybe some descriptions of these objectives, right? So going back to reduction of cost of living, right? So not only does it help people that don't have a car, but do we want to think, do we want to make this the same expense? In other words, if I didn't have to have a car, would it be just as expensive for me to pay, I'll just say $1, it wouldn't be $1, but $1 every day, and make up that difference, that difference of not having a car by using the rail? Or do I want to make it cheaper to incentivize people to use the rail and not have a car?
mhm.
Those are what do we want our system to look like, in other words, from that perspective? This gentleman over here, Mandak.
Of course, cost-wise, if lower than the actual cost of having a car, that would be great. But having said that, if it actually saves time for people, then it can be equally as expensive or costly. That's fine.
Ah,
Good point.
yeah, very good point. Okay, so along those lines, maybe one of our goals is not necessarily, we don't necessarily care exactly what the cost is, as long as it's an efficient way of getting from point A to point B. Okay, so efficiency,
Mm-hmm.
efficiency, an efficient system. And then as far as going to the environmental benefits, right? Not only are we saving air pollution because we don't have as many cars on the road, but the system itself is going to need to operate with something. So what do we want our system to look like? The trains, not from what they actually look like, but do we want to make sure that this system is the most efficient possible from an energy perspective? Do we care about that at all, as long as it's moving more people?
Mm-hmm.
Anybody? I'm gonna say, if I was coming into your city, I would want it to be the most environmentally friendly system that I could ride. So I'm going to say a priority for a stakeholder, myself, which we'll call my group the tourist group. The tourists want to see an environmentally friendly system.
Mhm.
So
And
environmentally.
do you all have carbon reduction goals for climate?
Yes. Mongolia got in a Paris Agreement of the reducing carbon dehydration.
Fantastic. So maybe one of the goals of this system is that it does its part to meet the Mongolian government's goals of the Paris Agreement. It's a good one.
Mhm.
Perfect. All right, so I'll mention Paris Agreement. So now we have some of our objectives and our goals for the system.
Yeah, and maybe we could back up a little bit and I don't know if this map is even accurate. I found a tourist map here of the city, just as a graphic. But there are some of the points that you all addressed. You know, why would you want to do this? I'm not even sure what this tourist map covers. It probably doesn't cover the airport, I'm guessing. But anyway, we should talk about stakeholders a little bit. Who would be the participants in the project? You know, from the city, national government, who do you think would have an interest in this project? All the stakeholders, just start with anywhere.
I think the parties, city governors office and Ministry of Road and Transport and Development Bank of Mongolia and New Recovery Policy Accelerator Center. Yeah.
Okay. Did you catch that?
I got
Samuel.
Mongolian Development Bank, the New Recovery Program,
The MUB municipality of Ulaanbaatar, MUB, MRTD.
That's right. I'm going to put DOT for my own notes. But yes, Ministry of Road. Okay, so those are some of the, those are really great answers. And those are some of the government stakeholders, right? Some of the different agencies that are going to be involved and have to provide input into the process in general.
Yeah, another way to look at stakeholders is who's going to benefit from the project that might be interested, and who's going to be adversely affected, if anybody. So let's try to identify those groups as stakeholders.
So let's take the first one. Who would benefit from the project in general?
Also, I forgot to add some private sector.
Yes, private sector is a stakeholder as well, yep. Okay, so as far as people benefiting from the system, what stakeholders would benefit from having this system in place?
You're forgetting a very important group. The people that are going to use it, right? The users.
So the general public,
Yeah,
right? The users,
the communities.
the residents of Ulaanbaatar.
Landowners,
Yeah.
property owners.
That is a really good one. Landowners adjacent, I'm going to put. Okay.
Any public interest groups that might, I don't know how you're organized in terms of advocates for different issues, but are there any public interest groups, not-for-profits, that might really support a project like this because it benefits whatever their, their main interests are? Can you think of any?
Can you, even I'm having a hard time of thinking through who a
Well,
public interest group would be. Can you?
Well, that would be like an environmental group.
There will be Ministry of Environment and Tourism.
Tourism,
Uh-huh.
Yep.
yeah. That's an
they will be
economic.
the one of the stakeholders, I guess.
Mhm.
Are there any, so on we have the Ministry of Environment and Tourism. Yes, they're the ones who, they have the Ministry of Environment and Tourism. What about people that complain to the Ministry of Environment and Tourism, right? The people, like in the US, we always have the people that want to save the trees, you know? There's a reason why that Ministry of Environment and Tourism exists.
That's kind of what I was getting
Yeah.
at for the not-for-profits. I mean,
So,
in the
do you-
United States, we have environmental groups that are either opposed or supportive of projects. So
Yeah.
do you have those kind of interest groups in the city? You do, I'm sure.
Will have.
Will have.
We'll have, yep, yep.
Okay.
So there could be multiple, right? But to Chris's point, there's always going to be some sort of interest group that says, "Wait a minute, you didn't talk to us. We have an idea of what this should look like." So special interest groups from the public.
Did they mention finance ministry? I thought you did, maybe. Did you mention the ministry,
well,
Ministry of Finance?
Mongolian Development Bank.
Okay,
We can
yeah.
lump some sort of financing.
Mhm.
Also, I want to add the Ministry of Energy because this project have to provide with electricity.
Yeah, you gotta.
But in Mongolia, the installed capacity of electricity is shortage.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a very interesting.
Yeah,
point.
we still import the electricity from Russia and China, and our domestic electricity capacity is not good. So we have to think about the electricity for this project.
So I'm gonna write that down. That's a potential hurdle that we're gonna have to
That's-
figure
yeah.
out in the future. That's a very good point. Power supply. Okay, so I think we've covered the
Yeah.
stakeholder groups. I would say if there was one more, since everybody has mentioned that this line goes to the airport, I would say the airport or the airport authority is probably a good entity to talk to as well.
Yeah. Yeah, very important. Now, do the potential stops here benefit government agencies? I don't know if they're located along this alignment in terms of workers. Maybe not.
Cool. Would you like to move on to maybe the next?
Yeah, then I guess the next area might be, we have do we have organization on? I think we do. If we don't, we should talk organizational assessment. But before we do that, let's talk about the scope of the project. And this is always an interesting exercise, and we don't have any transportation engineers in here, do we? Other than Samuel?
I wouldn't call myself a transportation engineer, but
Because one of the decisions you have to make is what alternative do you want to use for this transit system? And, these are just some of the options that are available. And there's a description for each one. Streetcars can kind of stop anywhere along the block. Light rail transit, people are more used to. They're similar to streetcars, but they're a little heavier. They hold more people. Obviously, you're not going to put high-speed rail in an urban setting like this, so you could eliminate that, and probably commuter rail as well, because I don't think it's connecting suburbs, is it? The system in Washington, D.C. is really a commuter heavy rail, and it goes within the city to different stops, but they're about a half mile apart, so it's not like serving the whole alignment. So you'd have to have your technical people kind of analyze what's the best solution here. And, the bus rapid transit systems are a lot less expensive, but they defeat some of your goals, in terms of pollution. They probably don't affect congestion as much as a transit system that holds more people. But you'd want to analyze that because the cost of those bus systems are much less. You know, they're a fraction of a cost of a system that rides on rail, has overhead electricity, and all the elements of a transit rail system.
Well, can we pause right there and think through, maybe talk through a couple of the goals and objectives and how maybe the technical solution would be either in line or not serve our purposes, right? So thinking through one of the goals and objectives of our project is to be reduce air pollution and help us meet the goals of the Paris Agreement for the government of Mongolia. Now, for this exercise, we're going to assume that these buses are not electric buses. They're still running on good old diesel. So if we had to choose, and here's the other part, the other assumption that we need to make, that anything that is on a track, if it's a rail system, it's electric, right? It's electric. So if we had to choose between bus rapid transit, which is significantly less expensive, or a light rail system, which is very much more, or it's more expensive, but yet which one of those would help us meet our goal, right? That goal and objective of we want to reduce air pollution, be environmentally friendly, and help us meet the goals, or the Mongolian government's goals of the Paris Agreement. Of those two options, which one do you think would be the better option? And there's no right or wrong answer. This is strictly opinion. Well, I'm gonna go with Mungunzul. Sorry.
LRT.
LRT.
LRT,
light rail.
LRT,
Yes.
got you. Okay. Yes, that would be my guess as well. LRT helps us meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So
One other part of the scope is, you know, the elements of these kind of systems. You're going to have stations that have to be built. Where are they going to build? They're going to displace some parking. Another item is parking to get on the system. So you're going to have land and figure out where that goes. So that's all part of the scope. You'll need a maintenance facility, which isn't necessary right now. So you have to have a piece of property that you can take these trains and get them reserviced and all that. So these are just other elements of the scope that need to be part of your evaluation of alternatives. Not much really to say about that, but that would be something to put into the equation.
no, I think so. So we'll stay on this slide real quick, because this is with regards to scope, we want to also think through some of the potential risks of each scope, right? We've already decided that the light rail system helps us meet most of our goals and objectives. So we've decided on a light rail system. That's the direction we want to go. Well, as Chris mentioned, that comes with its own set of considerations, right? But a light rail system has to have track the entire way, and that track can't be broken up. So if you have to cross over any streets, do you want it to be on the street itself and let cars have to stop for the rail system? Or do you want it to be elevated above the streets to make sure that to allow cars to flow freely underneath? Hopefully there's less cars, but to flow freely underneath. For this exercise, we won't assume it's going to go underground. That's very cost prohibitive. But thinking through what that looks like, right? What do we want our city to look like? What else would be a good, thinking through what for scope, Chris, we have?
Well, the parking, there will need to be some parking in order to get passengers that are commuting, using this as part of their commute. So that's just a consideration. You're gonna have to finance. That's an extra piece of construction cost.
Yeah.
The other thing is your power distribution. Now, they have light rail that has the overhead wires. They call those catenary. They're in the overhead public space. So some people don't like the looks of them. There's a appearance problem. They're a little more dangerous because they're live wires. That's really not been a problem over the years in those systems. But you could have electricity, you could have battery operated electric rail cars. There are more and more of those that are battery operated, and they get recharged at either end. Whenever they stop, there's a recharging system. So you eliminate some of that scope of overhead wires and the power sources and all that. So, yeah, I mean, one of the considerations or hurdles actually is disruption to the businesses along where the project's going to be built. So there are stakeholders that need to be also included because they may be shut down during construction for periods of time. We have a project in Washington, D.C. right now where it's a light rail project that has forced a lot of businesses to shut down. Now it's been delayed 2 years, and they're going to be shut down even further. So there's a lot of complaints from that stakeholder group. So that has to be part of your consideration. You may be taking away street parking from them in the way this is laid out and replacing it with garages, which may not be, as conducive to their customers. So again, the scope has to go back to the stakeholders, has to go back to the scope. You have a iterative process to design what your ultimate alternative is going to be.
Yeah, and then the other big question is, how many trains do we need? And maybe we need more trains for one section between the city center and that far area where people want to live. And maybe there's not as many people going to the airport, so we have less trains. But understanding the capacity of the system and building for future capacity as well. Want to go to the next slide, Chris?
Yep. Some of this is detail you don't really need to worry about too much, but there are references about the cost of the different systems and the future operating costs, the energy costs. So they've analyzed these things. So you can see streetcars are pretty affordable in the grand scheme of things. And an elevated train, a sky train, which is the third line down, is much more expensive. So you can take these kind of, in your feasibility stage, screening stage, you can take these kind of estimates to help you make those decisions. And so this is just an indication of one study that's been done in Canada that has really analyzed each of these alternatives we were talking about. It even goes down to cars, Toyota Prius versus Ford Explorer. Electric cars are part of the comparison too, but it just shows you it's a complicated decision.
So, Chris, how would you help? Using this example, how would you help kind of narrow down that scope or make a decision on scope based on this?
Well, there may be serious limitations. I think, as we heard from the head of the accelerator program, I don't know if it was the cost of the program was 30 billion right now. Maybe there's only 10 billion available. So if this project is 2 billion, do they want to take that much away from their total? Just to give you a little source of comparison. So, it may be that your budget limitations will drive which system you use, because if it's something that's not affordable, you might as well eliminate that. So a lot of it depends on your financing plan as well and availability of public funds.
Gotcha. Cool. So looking at your scope and having good cost estimates for the scope.
Now, one other item on scope is, you have to analyze how much land this is going to take, what they call the right of way, because it may require the city purchasing some land for the maintenance facility, for the parking structures, for the stations. They may have to widen the road. They may take up some sidewalk because they've got to put this, if it's street running and not elevated, because street running is going to be less expensive. Systems that maybe serve poorer communities may have a for the ticket. So that all has to be part of the equation because the fares are part of your source of funding.
Yeah. So I think the other thing we haven't touched on is maintenance of the system. Chris talked about maintenance facilities, but is this something that we as a government want to be performing, right? In other words, do we want to have our own employees fixing those trains and fixing the tracks? Or is that something that for us in the long run is better to have someone else worry about that? Those are cost considerations. We don't have that information, but certainly cost considerations, but things that you should look at for sure. The operations and maintenance component, in other words, of any project.
Yeah, and they do have estimates of that too, I think on that prior slide. Yeah, there are some estimates of energy cost. Not sure I see O&M, but there are estimates that you can get for that. Let me talk a little bit about financing, which is a really important part of this whole thing, and talk a little bit about an experience on a project I was involved with in Washington, D.C., which was a very expensive extension of their metro system into out to the airport, not unsimilar to this one. But it was going to be very expensive, and these projects are very expensive. So with identifying beneficiaries, stakeholders, you need to begin to develop a financing plan. And a project like this, let's say your project's $2 billion, that probably is not going to come all from the government. Because as we said, if the government's limited to $10 billion for its total infrastructure development, it may be hard to say $2 billion of that, 20% of that goes to this one transit system. So you have to look everywhere you can for other funding sources. And, you mentioned the airport. The airport's going to benefit from this. So the airport collects passenger fees. So if they have that funding source, and this is going to help get them more passengers, they ought to make a contribution to the system. You have landowners, and they are key stakeholders. Transit systems historically have increased the value of the surrounding property significantly, and there are many studies that have shown that. And they also, I think as mentioned, they allow greater density, which means the property they own now can be developed further with more people. And so those landowners need to be organized and grouped together as a stakeholder to say, we want you to contribute to the benefits you're going to get, contribute something to the cost of the project. And so there are things like special assessment districts, tax increment financing, a number of things that are worthy of a whole separate program. But this page just shows some of the funding sources you might have. Farebox is hardly going to pay for any of the project, as I think Samuel mentioned yesterday. These projects aren't self-supporting based on what people pay to ride them. They probably never will. There's many other benefits to the project other than, like, for example, a toll road, getting a car from here to there. So they have to be funded through various sources. And this list on the left are just some of the things. You're going to have parking revenues. If you have a parking garage, those parking revenues can help fund the project as well as the garage. You might have some shared use like telecom or fiber that could be installed with the project. You could get some money from a telecom company. Advertising is used on these often. So this is just another area of evaluation, because when you look at alternatives, you have to figure out, is this affordable? That's one of those early screening questions that has to be answered. And if it isn't affordable today, can you figure out a path to affordability where you can find more sources of funds?
Yeah, so along those lines, tying this back to our exercise, we'll make some assumptions for the sake of this exercise, right? We know the cost of the system according to our write-up is $5 billion. But let's just say we only have $2 billion to put at this system. We've looked at all of the other areas, the potential revenue sources and funding streams for our project, including any sort of money that the government of Mongolia wants to put in. And we looked under all the couch cushions, and we were only able to find $2 billion. So that means we have to finance another $3 billion of it. And we have to find funding for it as well, but we'll figure that one out down the road. So we know based on our analysis that we need to include some sort of financing component into the scope of this project.
Yeah, I'll just relate again to some experiences I've had with transit. The project I mentioned in Washington, D.C. that extends to the airport was originally going to be a bus rapid transit. And the stakeholders didn't like that idea. They didn't care that it was cheaper. The property owners, commercial property owners, wanted a rail system. So all of a sudden the cost went from, let's say, $500 million to $3 billion. So those property owners who wanted this so badly were asked to create a special assessment district to help fund the project. The statutes and your laws have to allow this. I imagine they have something like this where you can create, either through city ordinance, a special assessment district where a portion of the tax, property tax, could be allocated to a special project, dedicated to a project. And that kind of money, depending on the economic analysis, could be used to create a revenue stream to issue bonds off that money, that increased tax base. So one of the things, because this group wanted rail and it was going to cost a lot more, the project sponsors basically said, well, you're going to have to contribute 25% to this. And so they had to organize themselves as a stakeholder group of commercial landowners. And I mentioned yesterday, the way they did that is they got a former governor from the state from each party. One was a Democrat, one was a Republican. They were both respected individuals, and they became kind of the co-champions for the project landowner group, which they called LEADER, and I can't remember what that stands for. But that group spent some time with those stakeholders telling them how this would benefit them. The land use plan allowed greater density if there was a transit stop. So this was largely a built-out corridor, and Tyson's Corner is a part of the Washington suburbs, which is a big shopping area, commercial district. And all of a sudden, it would allow these owners to build much greater density. So all of a sudden, their property, which was already valuable, became much more valuable. So this was an incentive because of the land use plan and what it allowed for them to raise additional, taxes on themselves, basically, by creating this tax district. The other thing that can help in the financing is that they allowed for transferable development rights, TDRs, I think they're called. So if a landowner had a project that occupied, his floor area ratios were 1.0, and now he could do 2.0. He could build a twice as tall building. And those floor area ratios are real estate terms, but that's an indication of density. They could take that extra 1.0 of development rights and trade it to another area. So it made that even more valuable because they could relocate that development somewhere along the corridor. It didn't have to be right on their property line. It could be other property they owned someplace else. So these are the kind of incentives that can help create a significant additional funding stream for this project. It really amounts to, I think, $800 million is going to come from this tax district. And it could have been even more than that, but they were smart to cap it. They said, we'll allow ourselves to be taxed 25 cents on $100 assessed value or whatever it was. But we're not going to allow you to collect more than phase one, 400 million, phase two, 400 million. So, you're going to have to deal with that. I mean, nobody wants to write a blank check for unlimited funding. But anyway, it was a really key part of getting a finance plan together for this. And then the state provided half of it, and the federal government provided 25%. So that's just an example of the importance of stakeholder engagement and identification of beneficiaries, and where you can try to extract some financial contribution that somehow equates to their benefit. So maybe we should talk about what are some of those other bullet points,
Oh, I think
Samuel?
you've covered a lot of these bullet points already.
Yeah. Key risk and mitigations.
Oh, I thought you meant the ones on the slide.
Oh,
was like, I
yeah,
don't
no,
know
not
about-
this one. We need to get to
Yeah,
delivery options
I
at
think-
some point.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think we're good on scope, right?
Yes, yes.
We've worked through the scope a little bit.
Oh, this is just something I wanted to show you. In terms of your planning, your project management plan, this is the City of Ottawa, Canada's project organization for their light rail project. So, of course, this is the city's organization. The contractor might have the same thing. It's a much, much bigger project than you have, but this is another part of what you need to consider in evaluating alternatives. The bigger the project, the bigger you're going to have to hire expertise and develop an organization to manage it. Obviously, the 5 people at the Ministry of Economy and Development are going to have to be supplemented probably by a project office to manage a large project like this. Let's see what else we had.
So that can maybe talk about organizational assessment, but let's go to key risks and mitigations, I think, based on some of the scope that we have. So far, we've talked about implementing a light rail system that we know we need to finance. What do you think would be some of the risks involved with this project? Political risk, yeah, for sure. Do all the politicians want this project? There's a list of 90 projects that are in the New Recovery Accelerator. This is just one of them, right? And maybe there's a project somewhere else in another province, or that is important to that politician. So understanding what this looks like in the grand scheme of things, political risk. That's a very good point. What other potential risks do you think would be involved? Maybe looking at some of the environmental aspects, right? I know there's a river in the middle of the city. From this, technical perspective, looking at some of the environmental aspects, there's a river, so we have to cross the river somehow. I'm assuming I didn't get a good look at that map, but I'm assuming at some point we crossed the river. So how do we deal with the river? Right? How do we protect the river? That is a risk that we need to look at and mitigate in some way, shape, or form.
Think
Rather-
about, also think about building a project through the middle of an active city that's already built out. What are some of the risks associated with that? You have people living there, you have people working there, you have all your gas, electric utilities there. What are some of the risks? You have property that is owned and not the projects yet. So what are some of the risks along those lines of just putting this down the middle of a existing city?
Conflict with the citizens, and the project implementing agency might drop the project midway. They might get disinterested, and also there could be delay in financing and disbursement. And also because we already have the mains and the main infrastructure underground, we might have to change the routing of the project, and there could also be lack of a power source.
Yeah, no, exactly. The power source is super important, right? So how are we going to get that power? And if we don't get it, what happens? What happens? So that's a risk for sure. The agency may be losing interest in this project because it's taking too long or the financing isn't clear, whatever. That's a very good point. Very good point. So making sure that everybody is on board, interagency cooperation, right? Interagency cooperation. Trying to think what else you mentioned. Underground. Sounded like you mentioned underground utilities and maybe having to change the route. So yes, so understanding the alignment, understanding where the rail system is going to go, and if there are any major obstacles, right? Okay. Those are very good assessments.
Okay, in my point of view, I would mention two risks for this project. The first one is financial risk, because this project cost is so higher than any other project. In today, Mongolian debt reached the maximum. Also, private sector and the commercial banks have not enough money to invest this kind of project. And the second risk is the human capital, because we didn't implement this kind of project before in Mongolia, so we don't have any know-how and human capital. So maybe we have to hire the engineers from abroad and something like. Yeah.
Very good points, both of those.
Cool.
Yeah, there's the lack of experience on the public sector side is a big risk. And you have to, you just have to understand that going in. You have to start sometime if you want to modernize your city, but it is a risk that needs to be considered. That's a very good one, as well as a political risk, or the new director of transit decides midway through the project that now it's costing too much, it's taking too long, I want to stop. I mean, that's a risk that the private sector is going to look at, or do they have the staying power, to get through this to the other end, even if there's, changes and those kind of things. Yeah.
Okay, so staying on this topic of risk, just because there's risks involved doesn't mean that we don't do something, right? Matter of fact, that's why we're looking at these public-private partnerships, is to try to help out, try to mitigate some of those risks, transfer some of those risks. So if we look at the interagency cooperation, right, talking amongst the different agencies, potentially one agency saying, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. How could we prevent that from happening? Well, I would just say that's a tough one for sure, right? That is a tough one. But I would just say that, you know, making sure that all of the different ministries are on board. They know why we're doing this. They know all of, you know, that everybody's on board. And then if there's any sort of processes you need to put in place so that to prevent one agency from pulling out, right? Maybe it's an act of parliament that needs to happen for this project not to move forward because one agency pulls out. Then those are things that you need to do before moving forward with the project to mitigate those risks. You mentioned, and as Chris mentioned, there's the alignment where this project goes through, right? The river, the utilities, all sorts of things. The technical challenges throughout the alignment. What are some of the ways that we can avoid any problems in the future? Any thoughts or ideas? I'm sure you have some thoughts and ideas. You've worked in this stuff before.
Say it again.
So, you know, any sort of technical challenges with regards to utilities or the alignment, crossing the river,
Oh, yeah.
those sorts of things.
So, for example, again, back to land use. This is the biggest obstacle, whatever you plan and implement. Even it seems like a small, but for example, a small park, still building the park, still issue because we don't have land, free land. So that means specifically for this project, I think the land ownership or negotiation, putting the alignment, this would be the biggest obstacle.
So optimizing the land use, it sounds like.
Planning.
Okay, so we're optimizing land use. And I would add to that maybe also, once we've optimized the land use and we know it is the appropriate alignment to make sure that everybody's on board. We're not going to get any stakeholders, you know, hollering and trying to kill the project. What is underneath us, right? We can do investigations to understand what is underneath us, what we have to build on top of or over. And we can either do that ourselves as an agency, pay for that, or we can pay the private sector to do that. And they take on that risk. It's completely up to y'all. If it was me, I would spend a little bit of money in the beginning to do some investigations. But it sounds like maybe money is tight here. So maybe we're going to include that in the scope, right? But making sure that we have all of the technical investigations performed to make sure that we don't have any hiccups in the future.
Yeah, let me tail that with, you know, the fact that the delivery approach might help in that utility risk, which can be really, really significant. And, you know, as Samuel said, you can do a lot of drilling, subsurface excavation, go to the utility, find out if they have drawings of where pipes are. Often that's not the case. They may have been there for a long time. The records may not exist. So there is definitely a big risk that when you begin to install your project, things aren't where they were supposed to be. So we'll get to delivery options in a minute, but if you phase the project to have a first phase where the contractor is paid perhaps a fixed amount of money to get rid of all those risks, to mitigate, investigate, and make sure he's clear about what it's going to take to build the project. And then the phase two, his price will be much more certain, and he will have mitigated that risk. Now, the problem with that is you've got to pay for him to do it, or you pay for yourself to do it. But it can be done in a way where he or she, the developer, might take the risk of that first phase because he wants the project. If he's already got the contract, he might do that at risk, invest the money in anticipation of negotiating a fixed price for phase two. And that might be take it all at risk, or maybe just get paid a small portion of it. And then phase two would recover those costs. But at that point, you've got a much more viable project.
All right. And then the financial risk. Any thoughts on how to overcome the financial risk? I know we talked about already looking at doing some finance, asking the private sector to finance parts of it, but as you mentioned, there's already some hurdles, right? Maybe we don't have to have the exact answers, but maybe some other analysis that we need to perform. Can you think of any analysis that we might want to perform to get us to a more clearer picture on the financing of this project? I don't know myself, to be honest with you. I'm not the finance guy.
Maybe we can ask ask help from the abroad, like in European Infrastructure Development Bank and EBRD and ADB and something like.
So look into alternative funding sources.
Yeah, ADB, EBRD, and IMF, International Monetary Fund.
Cool.
And also Development Bank of Mongolia. I think they have money.
Okay. All right, so we've looked at, these key risks and we've tried to mitigate them as much as possible. And we know there's a lot of technical challenges involved. There's an entire other technical challenge that might be this power supply thing, but let's assume that we're gonna get over that in some way, shape, or form. We know we have a financing issue, and it sounds like what I heard is that we obviously don't have a light rail system in Mongolia, so we don't really know how to build one, much less operate and maintain one, right? So those are some of the challenges that we're facing. Using that information, then this, now we have a clearer picture of what the feasibility of this is. This is a feasible project, right? We've found ways to overcome some of these hurdles. But it sounds like we're almost at that decision point now where, because of the inherent characteristics of the project, because of some of those challenges that we need to overcome, it sounds like to me, Chris, you can chime in as well, but the technical risks would behoove us to have a design builder take on that risk. Obviously, there's a financing component, and we're not the best in operations and maintenance, or at least we don't have that expertise. So knowing all of that, I would say we're probably going to look at doing a design, build, finance, operate, maintain type project, full on P3. So then we get to, and that basically covers our delivery options analysis, right? In a nutshell, that's the point we were trying to get to. But now we come to the always important part of organizational assessment. Do we have the expertise in house to be able to carry something like this out? What sort of potential skill sets or potential knowledge do you think that a project like this would need from an agency perspective, right? From each of your individual agencies where you come from, but also assuming that you're not going to, the government itself is not going to build it, how is your agency going to ensure that what that partner, that private sector is building is what you guys want it to be, is doing the right thing, the oversight component? Any thoughts on, this is, y'all know your agencies better than mine, and your what the role of the agency should be. Any thoughts? Yes?
Road engineers.
Yeah? Road engineers? Yeah. For sure. Anything else? That's that technical component. We need some people with some specific technical knowledge, because this project that we're
Okay,
not familiar with?
let me say this. It's real project. For example, water supply project for the wash plant for Ernest Town Toloy, which is the active project currently. So it's about to complete. Just recently I visited TT site. My question is exactly same. So who will operating, managing water supply system? So it's a project being done under EPC contractor. So a contractor will give the key June 1 or July 1. What happened on July 2nd? This is my question. So unfortunately, yeah, this is not clear yet until this moment. This is the bad example I am given. But the good example is from the start. From the start of the project, we need to have very clear vision who will manage in this water supply system and be involved from day one.
Did you say who's going to maintain?
No,
Operate,
operating.
manage.
even.
Operate,
Yeah.
yes,
Operate,
yeah,
yeah.
that's a,
So that
important.
means it's very critical to identify who ultimately will manage light rail system.
Mhm.
So it's not that easy system. It's very complicated because it's safety involved, maintenance involved, and dispatch system involved. I mean, the transportation mobile system or control system. So that means, as I think someone mentioned about the human resource, this is the very critical part. So if we think this is the real project, probably we need to start thinking about building the workforce who will be operating the light rail, who will be maintaining the tracks, stations. As I said, probably we didn't mention about any safety concern, but again, this is the one of the biggest item.
Yeah.
Because it's probably a high speed. It's even though it's light rail, it's considered, but the safety should be one of the biggest concern. When train is running through 1.5 million people.
For sure. No, exactly.
Okay, this is kind of my thoughts
No, I
at this
couldn't agree more.
moment.
I couldn't agree more. And the other big thing is quality, right? Quality. You want a quality system. You're asking the private sector to build you a system that, for most things in the US are designed for 50 years, at least 50 years operating. Concrete structures, put it that way. So you want to make sure that they're building you a system that is 50 years. Along those lines, do we have the appropriate standards in place? Do we need that technical know-how? Right? This is something new to the country. We've built power supply before, so we know how to build power supply. We know what standards, we know what works, what doesn't with regards to electricity, but we've never built the light rail system. So where do we get that information from?
Yeah, I think we've identified why this might be good for a public-private partnership, because the city doesn't have the resources, they don't have the experience. And if they can fund it and they want it, the best way to do it might be, we kind of jump to the delivery option, but it might be to do it this way. And hire enough owners, representatives, or program management people to help the owner oversee it. That's a lot less expensive than staffing up to do the project yourself. So you still need some funding to make sure you have a project office, program manager, owner's engineer that understands these projects. It may not be as big as that city organization I showed. It may be more streamlined, but still you've got to have that expertise to make sure you can manage the private sector, who's basically providing most of the people that would be provided by the city historically in the traditional approach. So yeah, so that's good. We do have a handout, which I guess we might as well give you all, that has some of the questions that the private sector will be asking to see whether they want, to do this P3 that you might propose. And, some of the issues are, is the government credit worthy? I mean, are you at your debt limit? Do you have any capacity? What's your credit rating? Those things, they're not complete obstacles, but they're going to be considered. You know, do you allow international arbitration, which most international contractors will insist that you have an international arbitration clause? Does anybody know if that's, you may already know that, Grishma, but you know, international arbitration rather than local courts for these international developers will be critical. And you know, there's a number of other questions that they will ask that, you know, in preparing the project and developing your project management plan, you need to think about what they're going to be concerned about and make sure that those are all in place as well. And your advisors can certainly help with that process.
Yeah, the handout that Chris has is really good because, you know, it's good to know what the private sector is going to take into account.
And
Yeah.
you know, one other question, you know, in terms of the right of way, you know, does the city have the right to condemn property and take it? Or is it a more contested legal process that may take a long period of time? You know, that could be one of the fatal flaws in doing something in a, you know, populated area like this. So those are the questions that the private sector would probably be asking, and the public sector needs to prepare for and see if they can mitigate that, because that's a risk, obviously, if you can't get the property for the right of way. We may talk in the last hour about an example of a project, a P3 project in the United States, which has got all the people and lots of funding. They still ran into big problems on a transit project along that line of not having adequate right of way.
Cool. Yeah, this has been a really good exercise. You guys, this group has been very thoughtful in your responses and your knowledge base. This is good. This is really good. Thank you very much for this. Okay, we are back. We're in the home stretch now. That's a U.S. term for when you're almost done. It comes from horse racing.
Is it?
I'm pretty sure it
does.
comes from horse racing, yeah. Yep.